Following the discussion which we had just now about the three paradigms that have in a very significant way contributed to evolvement of public administration as an area of study, as a distinct area of study, as an autonomous field of inquiry, all these paradigms have significantly contributed to this very cause of developing public administration and providing its epistemological foundation. The academic content, the academic status. When we talk from politics administration dichotomy being the first paradigm which has really culled out public administration from the ambit of political science and gave it as an autonomous field of inquiry, it was taken up by people like IGNOU, who very well said that the locus of administration is in the bureaucracy in the government. Again followed by L.D. White, who in his book book pertaining to Introduction to the Study of Public Administration called upon certain principles that could in fact emphasize upon principles that contributed towards developing a science of administration. And again by Willoughby, who gave certain principles, again followed by Urwick and Gulick, who gave the post-corp, or even for that matter Max Weber's bureaucracy. All these classical thinkers and scholars, which are termed as classical theorists or thinkers, have given various principles, and even Henry Fayol, administrative management principles. So all these scholars have taken the background, the politics administration dichotomy, and has tried to develop public administration as a distinct area of study, as an independent discipline of study, and by way of their own works, by contributing to the locus and the focus of public administration as a discipline, have contributed to the lot. Then it is being followed by the other paradigm, that is about the market approach, cutting it short in the sense that because there was some kind of uneasiness with the kind of the traditional administration following this politics administration dichotomy was working or was functioning, the uneasiness because of this kind of working led to certain scholars to think in lines of having certain alternatives to the traditional administration. And that came up with a kind of a market or a business approach to public administration's theory. Rather, public administration was considered to be now being managed in the form of a business, where the people will be served in terms of the customers and they will have more choices. It laid down certain principles of profit making, of considering more outcomes, and cutting down the size of bureaucracy, downsizing, etc. And then it was followed again by the third paradigm, that is the new public service. And the new public service again came up because the traditional administration or the new public management, which was having the business concerns as its basics, failed to look into the needs of the citizens. Initially, when we talk about the traditional administration, the bureaucracy of the administration was basically working in a very categorized or a very isolated or very independent kind of an area with nothing to do with the kind of interests of the citizens. It was just implementing the policies given to it by the policymakers. It has nothing to do with the external influences of the organization which was impacting the policy. Again, when it comes to the paradigm that is NPM, it is more a business-oriented one, where profit and loss matters much as compared to the citizens' interests. So those who can afford to pay the market price for a product will have more, can get those products. But what happens to those who cannot pay? What happens to the poor? This was never looked into, and it was there where the hunger, the poverty, the deprivation, all in fact became further aggravated. So instead of being a panacea, it was more a trouble creator. Then the third paradigm, which I just mentioned, and it has been discussed also, is about where the people are at the center, and what matters in everything is about the public interests, and how the bureaucracy and the government are now vying to woo the citizens, not the customers, not the clients, not the beneficiaries, but seeing the citizens as citizens and giving them the space of involvement, of collaboration, of discussion, of public discourse and dialogue and participation. So when we discuss these three paradigms, with their kinds of contribution have led to the development of public administration as it is of today. But then there is one important thing which we cannot ignore, but then it has been ignored always, and that principle is that administration evolves historically. It should evolve historically. It takes its shape, it takes its nature, it takes its own character by responding to the changes in the societal transformation which takes place in a country or in a region or in a society or in a community. Why I am saying this is because this is a very significant point which has often been ignored. Why was public administration called out from the ambit of political science was owing to the historical context that was in fact there in America at that time. What was the historical context, or for that matter the political or the social context that time in America? Why was there a kind of a need felt by the scholars or the intelligentsia there to take out public administration from the jurisdiction of political science? Because there was a kind of technological revolution that was taking place. Also, on one hand, there was a technological revolution, industrial revolution taking place. On the other hand, there was an increasing population whose needs, whose demands, whose aspirations were to be met, and that laid so much of a pressure on the activities of the government, of the state. And the state's activities and its role was getting more and more widened in its scope and also in the complexity. And there was a need felt that if public administration was to remain within the political system, they are only serving the political masters, because they are appointed under the spoil system. They have to only serve the leaders and unmindful of what is required by the society or by the citizens. And with this kind of increasing pressure of the population, pressurizing the government to tackle the problems of employment, and with this kind of industrial revolution taking place, the role of the state, the government, expanded in such a rapid speed, with such a space and with such a pace and with such advances, that the scholars at that time felt that public administration has to be taken out of the arms of political science so that it learns to serve the citizens, their needs, to unburden the government's pressures. And there is where Woodrow Wilson very nicely says in his essay that it's very difficult to run a constitution than to frame one. It's easy for the policy makers to frame a policy, but to implement it is so difficult. And there is where Woodrow Wilson says that public administration needs to have a separate area of study. It is a distinct area, and if you study it separately, it will be definitely serving the citizens rather than the politicians. So far it remains in the political ambit, it will be only serving them because of owing to the spoil system that was in vogue there. So what was the context where political administration dichotomy came in, or why the scholars wanted this dichotomy? Owing to the kind of context, the situation that was prevailing in America at that time. And so this dichotomy worked well over there. And what Woodrow Wilson came up, it was followed by Frank IGNOU, by L.D. White. They all came up with different principles, laying down the focus of public administration or emphasizing on the locus of public administration, and therein they contributed to the principles, contributing greatly towards a science of administration, which could be universally applied across the countries, across regions, across organizations, across all levels of government. But sooner, in America, what happened that time? You wanted a kind of total avoidance of political science to gain your identity outside political science. So you had a strict avoidance of political science. But instead of developing your own identity or developing your own substance or your inner logic, what you did as public administration was that these scholars forget or compromise their dignity, and in order to get its own identity, instead of working for its own or identifying areas of research, they started following and getting the principles and practices from the area of management. Why management? Because Woodrow Wilson said that if the government has to run efficiently, if citizens' interests have to be taken care of, then it has to run like a business. And business takes its principles from the field of management. The government has to run efficiently. If you have heard Anita, she emphasized that traditional administration, or the classical ones, or these people who were the proponents and the practitioners of the politics administration dichotomy paradigm, were those who in fact wanted the government to run on basis of two important principles of efficiency and economy. And this is what is being practiced in management, in the commercial concerns, in the private organizations. And there is where they said that if those principles of management, or those principles which make the government run like a business, are adopted, then it is easy to implement the policy in the most efficient manner by the bureaucracy or by the administrators. And there is where, avoiding political science, the inclination or they were striving towards management, so as to make the state, the nation, the bureaucracy, the administration, the government work on business lines of efficiency and economy, unmindful of how it was compromising the dignity, the identity, the academic content, and the status of the discipline. And in America, it was basically, they were following the kind of ardent advocacy of having an autonomous and a practical discipline. And there is where they fail to understand that it will not be answering your boundary problem. It will not be looking into the theoretical underpinnings of your discipline. Here is where Fred Riggs and William Sayers say that this kind of premature professionalization or vocationalization or making public administration on management lines or business line is alienating the discipline of its academic foundation. Rather, Riggs says there's no need to isolate the two or ghettoize the two. Political science or policymaker and the implementers of the policy need to join hands to study the government as a whole system. But this was not being done. Until today, we face this problem because most of the policies made by the policymakers do not have administrators in making those policies. And policymakers or policy implementers, that is the administration, is only working in the area of implementing the policies, unknowing, unmindful of what goes into the making of that very policy. And this is happening. So when we talk about countries at that time, what happened was America started with this politics administration dichotomy owing to its context, and there is where many scholars had come in developing certain principles contributing to the science of administration, a theoretical body of public administration. But at the same time, the major fallback was that they were still harping on other disciplines for its own theory. For its own foundation, they were harping on other disciplines' principles. Instead of sponsoring certain research areas, identifying certain research areas, so as to develop those epistemological foundations of the discipline. At the same time, in the 40s, 50s and 60s, there was a notion of third world countries. These countries were those countries who got independent of the colonial rule, like us, like India. Now, when they became independent, they threw the colonial rulers, not the legacy. So the point was that when they became independent, they had nothing with them, no resources. There was a bureaucracy that was a kind of a legacy of the Britishers in India. And so what did the Western nations did for us, for these newly independent countries? What we can say that the world was at that time was divided into bipolar units. We had communism on one hand, and we had the capitalism ideology on the other hand. So these two ideologies, across which the entire world was divided, vied with each other to woo these third world countries to follow their own kinds of ideology. It was subtly they wanted to fulfill that economic imperialism. And seeing these third world countries just in that fledgling state, with nothing in their hands, starting from the scratch for their kind of development, for beating out that corruption, that poverty, that disease, that undernourishment, malnutrition, and so many other plethora of problems that they were having, they in fact wooed these countries with a kind of funding, with their own ideas, with their own values, with their own technologies, with their own opinions and influences, and said, these countries said to the third world countries, these capitalist countries and these communist countries said to the third world countries that we will give you money, we will give you our ideas, we will give you our technology. And so once upon a time we were also underdeveloped, then we became developing, then we finally achieved the status of a developed country. So likewise you will also follow the same chart. And all these countries, majority of these countries, took these very ideas and opinions and values and technology and funding of the West straight jacket. If you remember the first point, I said administration evolves historically. It should evolve historically. But the question now is whether in these third world countries administration evolved historically, looking into the social or the economic or the cultural context or the political context when they became independent. So once they copied, they replicated what was going on in the Western countries or in these communist countries to their own very society, to their own very political system, the failure was bound to be there. There was no second question about it. Why did we fail to assimilate our own traditional or indigenous bureaucratic alternatives to those Western paradigms, Western notions, Western ideas and technology? We failed to bring in those traditional development alternatives of ours with them. Maybe our traditional or indigenous bureaucracy, which was already existing here, was more apt to solve our problems of corruption or of poverty or of illiteracy or ill health, which the Western ideas and opinions and funding could not. And later the studies was that even the Western intelligentsia felt that it was not at all it did not solve the problems at all of these third world countries, rather aggravated those problems. Rather, it came to the state that these countries were not able to even meet the basic needs of their own people. So this kind of an approach was followed by these third world countries, who straitjacket replicated all the things that these Western nations and these communist nations were in fact doing, specifically so of the Western nations. And there is where the same thing followed here. We worked in that same dichotomous form. Public administration, as in American context, only to look into the policy implementation. Nothing to do with the public policy making. And also after the implementation, there are other phases and stages of public policy process, that is about the monitoring, the evaluation, the feedback and the review. Public administrators, as copied from these Western nations, remained to be the same way as they were in these Western nations, cocooned in the very stage of implementation. When we became independent, we are talking about our country, when we became independent, we carried on the same British legacy of keeping administrators to perform that instrumental role. And what was that instrumental role? To be an instrument of implementing the policies. Because at that time, the policy implementation was directly related to the social development and progress. If the policy implementation is right, is efficient, is cost effective, society will progress, society will develop. If the policy implementation fails, society will not develop to the way we want it. So the entire focus was on bureaucracy as an instrument in implementing the policies in the cost effective, in the economical way, in the most efficient fashion. And so what happened was, so much of money came in from Ford Foundation that time. Even the Ministry of Personal and Administrative Reforms invited Paul H. Epelebi. Why he was invited? To lay down the chart or the roadmap for administrative reforms. Everything was focused on reforming that administration, of imparting those skills and techniques to administration, of giving them training time and again, refresher courses time and again. Administrative Staff College came in, IIPA came in, Indian Institute of Public Administration came in owing to the recommendation of Paul H. Epelebi. The National Institute of Public Administration came in, and a plethora of institutes for training came in. Why? To disseminate those skills and techniques to public administrators, because they had this responsibility in a major way to implement the policies in the most efficient manner, because that is closely and very directly related to the development and progress of the society. And all these kinds of training in skills, in techniques and all, however, not only professionalized administration, but at the same time it made it very inward looking. The focus was entirely in the organization, within the organization. How to improve the administration which is there in the organization. What happens to the external influences that is reflected in everyday's behavior of that administrator was not at all considered. If any time there was a need, where there was a kind of a need felt, that there was a kind of a friction, what the organization used to do, or what the government department used to do, it used to tamper with the structural attributes of the organization. Like they will try to increase that dosage of division of labor, they will bring in more division of labor, or they will increase that specialization, or they will try to tighten the control, or try to have improved lines of communication and authority. So you try to tamper with all the kinds of structural attributes given by Weber, and that is just organizational tampering. Why? So that any kind of a friction can be removed, so that it helps the bureaucracy to implement the policies. Any kind of a policy failure was attributed to the failure in implementation, and every effort was then made to train him, to upskill him, to give him all those tools, techniques, refresher courses, etc., so that there is no failure in terms of policy implementation. Because if policy